Hello, this is my second video on the wonderful insect collection collected by David Allen and Peter Watkin-Williams in the mid to late 20th century. Most of this will be David's words about how he came to make this collection, what inspired him, a bit about his childhood and his adult life. But initially, here are a mixture of the tropical species, many of them African, which David and Peter captured all those years ago. So here are David's words. My grandmother had a small patch of vegetables at the far end of the garden in Stockland village. I remember noticing that there seemed to be several different sorts of white butterfly, whose caterpillars her gardener used to hand-pick from the brassicas, and I think that was the trigger that started me collecting at the age of about 6. I scavenged pieces of cork to be used for setting, rather unsatisfactorily, until I was able to obtain proper setting boards. Gradually I learned the art of setting, and my collection grew under initial tutelage from my mother, whose brother Peter had been a collector. Stockland, in the area now known as the Blackdown Hills in East Devon, was in the 1950s a parish of livestock farming on permanent layers of grass, untouched by pesticides or chemical fertiliser. Fields were small and surrounded by ancient hedge banks in a mosaic that included small copses and orchards. Here, uncommon species included the commer, high brown fritillary, brown hairstreak and purple hairstreak. We had a caravan on some rough ground outside the village at Quantock. Beside the caravan there was a tall, straight ash tree that attracted purple hair streaks in late summer. I hammered large nails into the tree's trunk so I could climb into the canopy and, armed with a long handle on my net, I was able to catch specimens. Looking back at this now, I wonder whether the ash tree was a master tree, as is well known to be used by male brown hair streaks that seldom descend to the ground. But the rough garden provided me at ground level with silver-washed, very occasionally high brown, and regularly both pearl-bordered and small pearl-bordered fritillaries. There were also marsh fritillaries in boggy ground on Quantock Common. Although visits to the East Devon coast introduced me to wood white and dark green fritillary, it was not until I was subjected to 10 years of boarding school in North Dorset that I was to find specialists of the Chalk Downs. Here I came across the Adonis and Chalk-Hill Blue for the first time, and the Duke of Burgundy was also a novelty. Soon I noticed that there were unusual variants or aberrations of the Adonis Blue and also in the ringlet, in which the amount of spotting on the underside is much reduced. Back in Stockland, I had long recognised that male and female butterflies sometimes differ substantially, as for instance is the case in the brimstone and the orange tip. But finding that there are female variants of some species was something quite new. The pale yellow form Helisae of the clouded yellow, and the dark green-grey variant Valacina in the silver-washed fritillary introduced me to sexual dimorphism. At the start of the 1960s, an opportunity arose to go to Singapore, where my parents were then based. Butterflies immediately reignited a passion to collect again, for in England I felt I had collected most species sufficiently frequently to be justifiable. Others were too rare and should be left alone. Butterflies in Singapore were startlingly beautiful and all unfamiliar, including a whole family new to me, the evening browns, Amethusidae. Some were spectacularly large, including the common tree nymph, that is one of the milkweeds, and others were brilliantly coloured, as were many of the swallowtails. Butterfly collection became addictive, but I found it was also informative to a budding biologist. From a family holiday into Malaya, as it still was, I realised that, by chance, I'd collected 3 distinct subspecies of a rather insignificant satyrid, the common palmfly, one from Singapore, one from the Malay mainland, and one from Langkawi Island. So here was a lesson on evolution. The island isolation leads to the development of new forms, and this is the process of speciation. On Langkawi Island, one of the swallowtails was the common rose, that I noticed had a carefree flight not the fast flight typical of its family. Then I learned that the insect is unpalatable to potential predators because it feeds on Aristolochia, or the pipevine, which is poisonous. Another swallowtail here was the common Mormon that, like the clouded yellow in England, occurs as two different female forms, one of which looks remarkably like the common rose, not only in coloration but also in behaviour. So here was a case of mimicry. Some Pierids were evidently also unpalatable, suggested by their bright colours. One example is the painted Jezebel, that exhibited warning coloration. Various mimic model associations that I found usually involved members of the milkweed family that are well known to be unpalatable. In Singapore, the blue glassy tiger I found was the model for the mimetic swallowtail, the common mime. On return home to school, I developed my interest in mimicry into a special project for A-level zoology. Years later, on qualification as an agricultural botanist, arrival in Africa was another stimulus to continue collecting butterflies. Near the Indian Ocean in coastal Tanzania, the genus Caraxes was the first to catch my eye, initially because of their large size and rapid flight, then because of the beautifully complex markings on the underside that are often silver-spotted. But once again it was mimicry that intrigued me. I came across the famous mocha swallowtail fairly early on. The widespread form of the male is pale yellow with long tails that make it unmistakable, but females eluded me for longer. Unpalatable potential models include the common African monarch, as well as the striking black and white Danaid, and in due course I was able to take a specimen of each of the corresponding female forms of the mocha swallowtail. Now I appreciated that, for mimicry to be effective, the mimic was necessarily rarer than its corresponding model, and that sexual dimorphism, or in this case polymorphism, can help to achieve this. In Africa, there were now other families that were new to me, most particularly Acreidae, many species of which are sparsely scaled with semi-transparent patches. All Acreids are apparently distasteful to predators, but some species look like Danaids. These were Malarian mimics. Repellent species look alike, with the result that a would-be predator needs to learn a single colour pattern. Both distasteful species thus benefit. An example I found was the colour pattern shared by the Danaid Amoris niavius and the Acreid Bemetistes, but the match between the two seemed less good than was the case with Batesian mimics, perhaps because selection pressure is less strong. In a particular environment, there must be pressure for selection on mimics for better mimicry. I found evidence for this once in western Uganda, where I saw that the widespread model Danaeus chrysippus occurred locally in a form lacking the white wing bar on the black tip of the forewing. Elsewhere, this species sometimes has a large white blotch on the hindwing. The Batesian mimic, the nymphalid Hypolimnus missipus, also occurred locally as a colour variant that matched those of its model, in an arms race that the mimic seems to have won. As I've mentioned already, Caraxes are among the finest of African butterflies, although only one species occurs in Europe. They're conspicuous by being large and fast-flying, and on closer inspection you notice the beautifully complex markings on the underside of wings that are often spotted or streaked with silver. When I was living in western Nigeria, I learnt to trap Caraxes by baiting them with either fermenting fruit, pineapple was good, for females, or with rotten prawns for males. Only once did I find the spectacularly large and brilliantly coloured Lycanid Epitola posthumus near a waterfall in the forest belt of Nigeria. And only once did I see the beautiful eastern black and yellow swallowtail Pelodorus. I noticed that it had settled on a muddy patch above a waterfall on the opposite side of the Great Ruo Gorge on Malanje Mountain in Malawi. Having just read Van der Post's Venture to the Interior, that describes the gorge in terrifying style, I was especially cautious in wading across the river immediately above the fall. This swallowtail is reputed to be a strong flyer and difficult to net, but now that I had a chance, net it I did. Reflecting on all this now, back in Stockland, it is easy to recognise camouflage among the adults of British butterflies. The comma, that overwinters as an adult, is a good example. It is ingeniously camouflaged among dead leaves and branches by its ragged appearance and warm brown colour. A crack in the leaf is perfectly portrayed by the brilliant white C in the middle of the hindwing. Warning coloration is well exemplified by the peacock, with its striking blue eye spots on the hindwing that, when exposed, have been shown to protect it from predation when approached by blue tits, intimidating the predator by bluff. But are there examples of mimicry among British butterflies? It is not hard to imagine that large and small white, that are unpalatable to predators because of the mustard oils they contain, are Müllerian mimics of one another. Or is their similarity merely evolutionary relatedness among Pierids? What about morphic species like the brimstone? It is tempting to suggest, as I have done elsewhere, that the greenish-white female is a Batesian mimic of a large white. Or is the dimorphism also the result of sexual selection for bright colouring in the male? Extensive observation in the field is required to determine whether the abundance of large whites affects predator behaviour towards other Pierids in the same area. This is David Allen writing from Stockland in 2022. This is Jamie Gundry here to complete this video. I'm very, very grateful to David for taking the time to write those words, and they are a beautiful memory of what he's collected and what he's done. For obvious reasons, I personally haven't collected any insects for well over 30 years, but I still think that these collections should be venerated and used to inspire passion and education. And that is why when in the mid-1990s, David gave me a large collection that Peter Watkin-Williams had never had the chance to set, I slowly worked through a portion of it when I was a teenager. Since then, I have given much of this back to Peter Watkin-Williams' grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they are starting to work through the remaining setting, because these are incredible and inspiring animals, and they deserve to be preserved properly rather than to sit folded up in biscuit tins. There will be more videos of this collection when I get around to it, although the next one is mating behaviour in grey seals on the Lincolnshire coast. So a little bit of a contrast to today's effort.